And welcome to all attending the RTA's virtual meeting of the Board of Directors. I want to remind everybody to please turn off or close your computer cameras for this session. While the governor's shelter-in-place order remains in force during the current COVID-19 pandemic and pursuant to his executive orders declaring a public health emergency, we are operating under the permission to conduct our meeting without the physical attendance requirements of the Open Meetings Act. Now let's review the guidelines before we begin. First, keep your audio on mute as much as possible in order to minimize background noise, which may impair the recording. When you have a question or comment, please raise your virtual hand. Audrey will call on members who have raised their hands one at a time. When she calls on you, state your name before beginning so your comments can be accurately reflected in the record or minutes. When we get to voting, if you wish to make a motion or second, clearly state your name and your intention, and the Madam Secretary will repeat for the record so that we have accurate clerical minutes for this meeting. Are there any questions at this time? I'm hearing none. With that said, I will now call to order of this meeting of the Board of Directors of the Regional Transportation Authority of Northeastern Illinois. Normally, we would rise for the Pledge of Allegiance in our boardroom, but since we are virtual, we will dispense with the pledge, just keeping in mind that we need to be one America during this extra difficult time in our nation's and world's history. Madam Secretary, will you please call the roll?
Certainly. At this time, to expedite the roll, I'm going to ask if you would all unmute, and then mute yourself after I call your name. Director Andolfio. Director Andolfio.
Here.
Director Carey.
Here.
Director Colson.
Here.
Director Frega. Director Frega. Director Frega, unmute your phone. All right, I see Director Frega. After I call your name, please mute your phone again. Director Fuentes. Director Fuentes.
Here. Did you hear me? Hello, hello.
Yes. Yes. Please mute. Director Grovin.
Here.
Director Higgins.
Here.
Director Holt.
Here.
Director Cotel.
Here.
Director Lewis.
Here.
Director Melvin.
Here.
Director Pang.
Here.
Director Ross.
Here.
Director Sager.
Here.
Director Troiani.
Here.
Chairman Dillard.
Present.
Director Frega, are you there, please? You need to unmute. Director Andolfio, please mute yourself now. Director Frega.
We'll come back and pick him up later in the meeting if he's attending.
Okay. I see 16. I'm going with 15 as I can't acknowledge Director Frega at this time. So we have a 15 and 1 confirmed.
Great. That's plenty for a quorum, and I thank everybody for their indulgence in this virtual meeting time. We'll move right along. Item 3A is the approval of minutes from the meeting held on April 16, 2020. If there are no comments or corrections, I will ask for a motion and a second to approve these minutes as submitted. please remember to clearly state your name so that Audrey can identify who's going to make a motion in second. So a couple of you brave souls, raise your hand and make a motion in a second, please.
Okay, I saw Director Cotel raised his hand first for the motion, and Director Troiani seconded.
Correct.
Thank you two very much. Audrey, take a roll call. That way we'll have a baseline roll call if we could on the motion 3A to approve the minutes of last month. Thank you.
Okay. Director Andolfio?
Aye.
Director Carey?
Aye.
Director Colson?
Yes.
Director Fraga? Director Fuentes?
Aye.
Director Groven?
Aye.
Director Higgins?
Aye.
Please mute your phones if I'm not calling on you. Director Holt?
Yes.
Director Cotel?
Aye.
Director Lewis?
Yes.
Director Melvin?
Yes.
Director Pang?
Yes.
Director Ross?
Yes.
Director Sagar?
Yes.
Director Troiani?
Aye.
Chairman Dillard?
Yes.
We have 50 ayes and 1 absent.
Great. So that is so approved. We'll go on to item 4, which is the public comment segment of the meeting. We've asked the public to submit their comments via electronic mail. Last month, Audrey, Madam Secretary, read the comments of the public into the record orally. Madam Secretary, have we received any comments that now need to be read by you into the record?
We have not, so we have no public comment for today.
Great, thank you. So let's move on to item 5, which is our hardworking executive director's report, Leanne Redden. Leanne, good morning.
Good morning, everybody. I have been sitting here quietly to not sort of confuse the issues. So good morning and welcome, and thanks for everybody jumping on this morning in these somewhat less than ideal conditions. And I certainly hope that everyone's doing well and is safe and healthy. So as I kick off, first slide, please. Where we always talk about what the state owes us. So through the end of April, the state owes the RTA $234.7 million in the combination of the ASA and AFA, and that's the match on and the reimbursement of the debt service, and the piece of the Public Transportation Fund, the PTF. The state is about 10 months behind on ASA payments, about 10 months behind on AFA, and the equivalent of about 3.9, to be very precise, months behind on the PTF payments. The year-to-date cost for us carrying short-term debt to support that is $1.4 million. So next slide, and as we move on to sort of bigger and more recent topical topics, since we last met, the RTA has continued to be in weekly communication with the Governor's Office, with the Illinois Senate and our House legislative leaders and the Illinois congressional delegation. The Illinois General Assembly, I think as most of you know, announced last week that it would return to Springfield for a 3-day session, which began yesterday and runs through Friday. Each chamber is following several safety protocols as part of that return. The Senate is meeting in the State House, and the House is meeting at the Springfield Convention Center. So practicing social distancing and doing things a little differently also. The legislative leaders have stated that the purpose of this session will be to address any essential legislation related to primarily the state budget, as well as any necessary COVID-related response items that they need to take care of. Related to this, we also sent a letter from RTA Chairman Dillard to Governor Pritzker and the full Illinois General Assembly detailing some of the current and the future potential impacts of COVID-19 on the region's transit system. And we shared that letter with you on Monday, so if you didn't see it already, look for it in your inboxes. And the RTA will continue to monitor all the legislative activity coming out of Springfield over the next 2 days, and we will continue to update the board. On the Washington front, Congress continues to debate the ongoing coronavirus-related relief measures. On May 15th, the House passed a $3 trillion relief package called the HEROES Act. That package includes over $15 billion in additional federal operating relief for struggling transit agencies. And like the CARES Act, the HEROES Act relies mostly on existing formula programs to distribute the majority of funding, with approximately 75% of all funding being distributed or contemplated to be distributed by formula. However, unlike the CARES Act, only transit agencies from the 14 largest urbanized areas in the US would be eligible for that formula funding. So this funding structure would likely result in, if it comes to fruition, and I want to put a big caution on the if there, would result in more than $1.3 billion in funding to the RTA region. Approximately 25% of the funding contained in the HEROES Act will be used in a discretionary funding program set aside for other transit agencies who need additional assistance due to the COVID-19 economic harm and the challenges that they're facing. So despite passing the House, future HEROES Act is uncertain, mainly when we sort of turn and look to the Senate, as the Senate Republicans have stated that it's unlikely that they will take up this legislation in its current form. But nonetheless, it's likely and encouraging that discussions and negotiations will continue as Congress continues to debate the nature and the extent of federal relief responses to the coronavirus. So we will certainly keep you updated. We are staying in touch with our delegation and with our, some people we have in DC, as well as with APTA, to keep us apprised of the latest on that. So next slide, please. We have a number of substantive items to cover in today's agenda, including the quarterly performance report and certifying the quarterly financials, initiating the 2020 budget amendment, and then the kickoff for our annual budget call, looking for the budget for 2021. So all of these are realistically impacted by the pandemic, and our staff will cover those in a bit more detail later in the agenda. But before I get into those items, I wanted to touch base with you on a few points as we pivot in the transit world from the crisis phase of the pandemic to planning for our recovery. As stated, the region contemplates plans for reopening the economy. The transit systems will need to adapt in order to meet the evolving needs of their constituents in a safe and fiscally responsible manner. And this will be a significant challenge as the decrease in economic activity, the changes in travel patterns that we see already now and that we likely will see in the future, cultural fears, including, around concerns about crowding, also may have a long-standing or potentially even some permanent impacts on mass transit. But I think one thing that we really need to remind ourselves, and we've seen come through, as we've been dealing with this pandemic, that transit is essential. And it's essential to support the economic activity. It's essential to support the workers that are critical to the front line of this pandemic. And we need to plan and prepare for the realities that lay ahead. So in light of this, I just want to highlight a few things that we are working on related to these changes. So first, there's a number of recovery task forces that are forming. I'm a member of the Mayor's COVID-19 Recovery Task Force, and also sitting on CDOT's, the Chicago Transportation Authority, Department of Transportation, I should say, their advisory committee regarding transportation reopening. And we're working to coordinate with CMAP and the county board chairs as a collective group. Additionally, we're engaged at the federal level, and I am sitting on APTA, our National Association's Recovery Task Force as well. Secondly, internally, our staff is initiating a recovery scenario planning exercise that we plan to engage stakeholders in. And as we work towards, how transit will be impacted in 2021 and beyond. We're also kicking off the budget call, as I mentioned, and we will examine other tools, programs, and resources that we should be exploring to respond appropriately to the effects and impacts of the pandemic. We are also requesting information from the service boards on how they plan to address the ongoing pandemic, as well as the impacts, both short and longer range. And you'll hear a little bit more about that in the budget call item. And thirdly, and maybe one we think might be the most critical, is that we continue to develop communication and coordination strategy for these future phases that build off our current efforts. And these include our weekly briefings that you and electeds and others are getting around the region, and expanding that information as it becomes more available, so people are fully informed and kept abreast of the work that we are doing and how transit is going to respond and evolve. So as an example, in the near future, we plan to launch a dashboard on our website of ridership, service changes, and financial information, and we will keep that updated on a rolling basis to keep people apprised. We'll also continue to keep you updated as we move forward with these efforts, and wanted to make you aware as the tough road ahead, what it looks like. And as we continue to walk towards supporting and enhancing our region's transit system, you'll hear similar themes in many of the board items today. So before we dig in a bit into the rest of the agenda, I just wanted to also highlight a couple of other activities that we've got going on, and I wanted to bring those to your attention, just to also make you aware that we're continuing to do other work beyond just the somewhat all-consuming coronavirus. So next slide, please. Can we have someone who may not be muted mute? And it's causing a lot of extra sound and a little bit of feedback too. Thank you. So the RTA has launched a free 4-part webinar series in place of our annual planning workshops due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. As they're titled, Transportation Tuesday series features RTA staff and regional leaders in transportation planning, community zoning, and mobility services management, leading discussions about the opportunities, the challenges, and the resources available in the Chicago region. There are 2 Tuesdays left in our series, and if you or anyone you know might be interested, you can visit our Ride On blog for registration information, and that information is also on our website. The agency is also updating the Human Services Transportation Plan. The last plan was adopted in 2013, and so it's time for an update. The plan's goal is to build on the existing network of transportation services that are provided across our region by both the public, the private, and human services organizations. As a part of the plan update, we've distributed online surveys to hear from riders or those who work in the sector, and we're asking for responses by June 8th. Links to that survey can also be found on our blog and on our website. This plan also guides the allocation of some federal dollars, specifically programs focused on people with disabilities and seniors. So it is a very important piece of work, perhaps even more so in light of the pandemic. Next slide. And finally, one activity that we have been able to continue during this time is our signage construction, our interagency signage construction. Most of you recall that RTA is adding wayfinding signs, transit maps, and service information at key interagency transfer locations throughout the region, through our interagency signage program. This month, we'll complete the fabrication and installation of signs at 6 additional locations, and they include Irving Park, Jefferson Park, Evanston's Main Street, Oak Park's Harlem Lake location, and in Waukegan and in Wheaton as well. 3 photographs of the work and the finished products are shown here on the slide that we're presenting right now. And we're pleased to have completed this work this spring, even despite the COVID-19 pandemic, and through careful coordination with the service boards and our municipal partners, and in compliance with the required safety protocols, we were able to get that work done. And just as a reminder, large portions of this work was actually funded through federal grants. And again, it's sort of also very important that we have this kind of information available for people who are required to continue to use the transit system now and in the future. So next slide. These final installations represent the latest step in interagency signage, and it's nearly finished. In 2012 was when we began this work. The RTA installed the first round of these projects signs at 4 demonstration locations. That same year, as I mentioned, we pursued a federal grant to expand that program to the additional 19 locations where high volumes of interagency transfers occur. And construction on the first bundle of expansion projects was completed in 2018. And then we continued with the second bundle, and they were the ones that are just completed, that I mentioned, completed earlier this month. The RTA now has signs installed at over 3/4 of the region's major transfer locations, and is now ready for the final and the third and the final piece of this program, and that comes up later in the board. So your approval of that final bundle 3 will be discussed a little bit later. The signs will be located and installed in 2020. They will include the areas in Blue Island, at Chicago Union Station, LaSalle Street Station, Millennium Street Station, and Ogilvy Transportation Center, and a couple of sites within Aurora. Additionally, we'll be asking for your approval on a contract to maintain those signs over the next 5 years. So with the end of the construction in site, RTA staff will continue to support the service boards and our municipal partners in sign installation by providing technical support and design standards and other insights that will really help people navigating in and around our transit system. So with that, I am happy to answer any questions and can turn it back to Chairman Dillon. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions?
Chairman Dillard, it's Audrey. I'm going to just check on Director Frager right now. I've had some conversations, and apparently he's tried to speak. So let me see if we can get him right now to have him validated.
Oh. Can you hear me?
Okay, Director Fraga is connected. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay,
I've heard everything so far, but I wasn't able to speak. Yeah.
Okay, well, we will be allowing you to speak throughout the meeting. If you have questions, I'm going to mute you, as I did for everybody else, so we don't have all the background noise. So thank you for. Finally, we're able to get you in, and you are counted as full attendance for today's meeting.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, John. Thanks very much. And Audrey, he will be added to the roll. We'll move on, and it's item 6A, which is a presentation of our quarterly performance. Jill, are you going to do this one?
I am. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, Chairman Dillard and board members. I'm here to present the quarterly performance report for the first quarter of 2020. Next slide. You, the RTA board, adopted Invest in Transit 2 years ago in January of 2018. The plan set a bold vision for public transit as the core of the region's robust transportation mobility network. It also established 3 goals that we use to guide our work. Today, I'll walk through each of these goals and tell you how we performed for the first quarter 2020. Before I do that, I should obviously acknowledge that COVID-19 has been impacting regional transit since mid-March. So what you'll see here is this quarterly report includes data from 2 relatively normal months in January and February, and one abnormal month in March. I'm going to try to point out to you where we are seeing impacts and where we expect to see more in the next quarter. Next slide. The first goal, deliver value on our investment, focuses on two key questions. Did we get more funding? And are we efficient stewards of the funds that we have? Next slide. We monitored progress on this goal for the first quarter of 2020 by tracking capital and operating funding and expenditures and comparing performance to the first quarter performance of 2019. Looking at quarter one results, annual capital funding was 83% higher compared to 2019. This increase is a result of Rebuild Illinois funds that are now included in the 5-year capital program starting this year. Capital expenditures were 13% lower. Each service board saw reduced spending in 2020 compared to 2019. Shifting to operating stats, the system-wide operating cost per passenger trip was up 14.4% at the end of the first quarter, after being adjusted for inflation. This is a result of a 2% increase in operating costs paired with a 10.9% decrease in ridership. Fare revenue per passenger trip, also known as the average fare paid, was up 2% to $1.84, resulting from the ridership decrease and 8.7 loss of fare revenue. The decreased ridership and loss of fare revenue impacting these operating indicators are a result of COVID-19. We'll likely see impacts to all these measures in the second quarter. Next slide, please. For our spotlight this quarter, I'd like to give you an update on the status of capital funding in Rebuild Illinois. We initially headed into this very positive about capital work on the horizon and the opportunities ahead with Rebuild Illinois. During our last quarterly report, we talked about how we were preparing for the influx of funding by working the cycle of improvement shown on this slide that begins with better processes so that we can build projects, celebrate progress, and get more funding. The future is now somewhat uncertain because the PAYGO funds and the bond funds estimated to come through Rebuild Illinois are dependent upon revenues that may or may not materialize in the current economy. That said, all three agencies have continued with robust construction programs during this crisis and have taken the opportunity to make improvements to their systems while fewer people are on them. So in this first quarter, the RTA did continue our current work with the cycle of improvement. We talked with IDOT to improve the processes related to selecting projects to fund and developing grant agreements. We also worked toward an updated investment framework through the Performance-Based Capital Allocation Committee that you asked us to develop last December. The working group has met 3 times over the course of the spring. We've come to a consensus about doing more communication about our capital program goals, process, and outcomes. RTA staff is working on a document summarizing this work that we plan to bring to you in July for release for public comment. The work of this group is also captured in the budget call that you are considering for approval today. And also part of today's agenda, we are requesting your approval of a capital amendment to advance many of the bond projects in Rebuild Illinois. We will continue to keep you updated on the status of Rebuild Illinois capital funding and all of the improvements that we are making, recognizing that this is a challenging time. Next slide. Moving on, the second goal of Invest in Transit is build on the strengths of our network, where we ask the questions, did the region become more transit friendly, and are we focusing our limited resources wisely? Next slide. For this goal, we have been measuring vehicle revenue miles, or the amount of service available to our riders over the past 10 years. The trend is upward over the last decade with a 4.4% increase compared to 2011. Compared to 2019, vehicle miles for the first quarter of 2020 was 1.4% lower. This decrease reflects a few immediate service changes that were made by Metra and PACE in response to drastic ridership declines on routes serving schools that were closed in downtown Chicago offices when the stay-at-home order went into effect on March 21st. Next slide. For the second goal spotlight, we're going to talk about the work that our agencies have been doing to maintain service during the pandemic. The RTA has been monitoring the actions of peer agencies around the country and the world to maintain and adjust operations. Some common actions include reducing service in areas of low demand while increasing services for essential workers, instituting rear door boarding on buses, offering free fares for first responders, limiting the number of people who board a bus or a train in order to maintain social distancing, and keeping the public aware of initiatives to maintain cleanliness. Our service boards have implemented most of the same policies. They've also been undertaking significant efforts to communicate with the public about their services. Here you can see examples from the websites of each of our service boards showing their efforts to keep in touch with the public and be responsive to their informational needs during this time. Next slide, please. This slide focuses on service changes throughout the region. Each of our service boards has tailored its operations to maintain the level of service they think is necessary to safely carry the riders who still need transit right now. This has resulted in some changes, which we are showing on this map so that you can see them on a regional scale. In the map on the left, you can see CTA, Metra, and PACE service prior to the stay-at-home order depicted by the darker lines. In the map on the right, the light and gray line shows services that have been reduced or eliminated. As of May 18th, Metra is operating about half of its regular service, and PACE is operating with reductions to approximately 100 routes. CTA did not implement reductions so that service remained available for essential workers and the transit-dependent public. I'll talk more about how many people are taking these services in the next few slides, but these maps show the status of transit availability and change as of today. Next slide. The third goal is stay competitive, which asks, are we providing the kind of services that people want to ride? And are people satisfied with it when they do? Next slide. For this goal, we've been tracking ridership as well as metrics related to speed and reliability, which influence whether people use transit. System-wide ridership for the first quarter was 114.3 million, a decrease, as I said before, of nearly 11% compared to 2019. As mentioned earlier, this stat reflects 2.5 relatively normal months of ridership and a few weeks of significantly fewer riders. The system-wide average speed was 14.9 miles per hour, similar to 2019. We are now providing CTA on-time performance in a similar manner as Metra and PACE. CTA's on-time performance averaged 86% for bus and 77% for rail for the first quarter. Metra on-time performance averaged 96.4% over the first quarter, exceeding their target of 95%. PACE's on-time performance was 86.7%, a less than 1% improvement from 2019. Next slide. For this quarterly spotlight, I'd like to talk about what is happening with transit ridership and movement around the region right now. Staff is monitoring preliminary ridership data reported by CTA, Metra, and PACE to determine the extent to which ridership has changed compared to 2019. This data is shown in the chart on the left of this slide. You can see that ridership was relatively normal for all modes in early March, then dropped suddenly through late March as businesses and schools were shutting down. This phase was followed by sustained low levels of ridership throughout the remainder of the reporting period for each service board. As of May 8th, transit ridership was down 85% system-wide. These numbers are staggering. We've also been monitoring regional travel, overall using a tool called Replica that we received through IDOT. This data is shown in the chart on the right. From that, we've learned regional travel has only declined about 50 to 60% since February. When we look at these two data sets together, we see that public transit has been more significantly impacted than other forms of transportation. The RTA has been compiling this information weekly and sharing it with the RTA board, the governor's office, and other stakeholders. RTA is also starting to look ahead to recovery and future stability. and we are collaborating on several recovery planning activities, as Leanne stated in her ED report. We will share some potential scenarios and actions with you in the coming months. Next slide. In summary, this first quarter of 2020 was the beginning of what is likely to be a tough season ahead. Transit capital continues, but service and ridership are experiencing serious impacts. The results for the second quarter are likely to be even more extreme. We will continue to stand by the vision and goals of Invest in Transit as we work towards the future. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jill. Anybody have any questions or comments? Please remember to use your hand raising tool in WebEx so the secretary can see who wishes to speak.
I am scrolling and I see no hands raised.
Great. Thank you, Jill. So we will move on to item 7, which includes items that require board action today. We'll hear from staff on these items and vote on each one following the staff remarks and any questions. The first is 7A, which is the resolution certifying the financial results for the first quarter of 2020. B, you want to give us these business figures?
Good morning. This is B. Raina Hickey, Chairman Dillard, and Finance Chairman Melvin, as well as members of the board. Today, I will cover the financial results for the first quarter of 2020, which are subject to board certification. The quarter began with 11 weeks of solid ridership and favorable expense performance, aided by good weather, and ended with 2 weeks of an unprecedented ridership collapse. The regional system generated revenue recovery ratio of 43.5, which excludes ADA paratransit, was 3.5 percentage points unfavorable to budget for the quarter, but was more than 12 percentage points unfavorable for the month of March, the standalone, indicating a rapid deterioration of the service board financial results. For this reason, staff is requesting board adoption of resolutions certifying that the operating financial results of the service boards, ADA paratransit, and the region as a whole through the first quarter of 2020 are not in substantial accordance with the adopted budget. The logic behind this recommended finding is all about the trends and the knowledge of what lies ahead rather than absolute first quarter results. Although the dashboard displays cumulative results of the first 3 months of the year, you can see from all the red how heavily those 2 weeks in March weighed on the quarter as a whole. Ridership fell sharply the week before the governor's stay-at-home order took effect and plummeted the week following the order, finishing the quarter unfavorable to budget by 12.8%, as shown in the lower right section of the slide. Each service board reported unfavorable ridership results in excess of 10%. PACE reported daily ridership in late March of about 30% of normal, CTA at 20% of normal, and Metra at about 5% of normal. The collapse in ridership dragged down operating revenue, which is shown in the top left corner and highlighted mostly in red. Each service board reported unfavorable operating revenue results except for ADA paratransit, which had some favorable ancillary revenue results. While the dashboard shows that year-to-date revenue was unfavorable by 9.8%, operating revenue for the month of March as a standalone was unfavorable to budget by 28.6% as fare revenue fell away. In the middle left section of the page, we have the public funding results. January sales tax came in about 9% higher as we rebounded from the polar vortex in prior year, and February was expected to grow about 1% over 2019. The real estate transfer tax had poor results in the first quarter, highlighting CTA's unfavorable variance in red. We'll talk more about the imminent sales tax drop-off in March and beyond during the funding amendment presentation following this. Notably, service board expense performance in the lower left section was good across all 3 months of the quarter, despite COVID-related expenses in March. Metra and PACE are highlighted in light blue with favorable performance across almost all expense categories. Now we move into the upper right section where we see mixed net results for the service boards. CTA public funding shortfall and nominal expense performance contributed to an unfavorable net result of $33 million, while good expense performance at Metro and Pace produced net result variances of about $3 million favorable. Finally, the middle right section shows that Metro and Pace both kept their recovery ratios close to budget for the quarter due to good expense performance. However, the regional recovery ratio was 3.5% points unfavorable to budget as COVID impacts began to take hold on our system. A strong start to the year, particularly for Metro, produced results that would otherwise be found in substantial accordance. However, our substantial accordance guidelines also requires us to look at the trend of the first quarter results with respect to year-end projections. And that look clearly shows the regional recovery ratio finishing well below the 50% statutory requirement, with each service board displaying rapidly worsening results over the 3 months of the quarter. This elicits a finding of not in substantial accordance. Normally, such a finding would trigger a requirement of revised service board budgets. However, our next agenda item on the proposed funding will be used to communicate to the governor and legislature our need for recovery ratio relief beyond what the CARES Act funding should solve in the near term. CARES Act funding would also be discussed in more detail during the next agenda item. In closing, I recommend that the results of each of the service boards, ADA Paratransit, and the region as a whole be found not in substantial accordance with the budget due to the rapidly deteriorating financial results. That concludes my remarks. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Back to Chairman Dillard.
Thank you, Bea, I think. Anybody have any questions or comments? If so, use your hand raising tool so that Audrey can see who wishes to speak.
I'm not seeing any hands raised.
All right. Then I need a motion and a second to approve item 7A as be submitted.
I see Director Andalcio was the first hand up, followed by Director Groven, which will mean Director Andalcio moves and Director Groven seconds.
Great, thank you. With that motion and second, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
16 ayes.
Any opposed?
I see no hands for opposition.
Great, thank you. On the next slide, we'll go to the standard fare, which is lead for the unanimous roll call. But 7A is approved. Thank you, Madam Secretary. B, let's go on to 7B, which is the ordinance authorizing a funding amendment for 2020.
Next slide, please. This morning, we are asking you to consider an ordinance amending the 2020 operating funding amounts to the service boards. This amendment contains expected decreases in 2020 RTA funding due to COVID-19 mitigation efforts and resulting job losses within the RTA region. It also includes federal CARES Act funding to offset those RTA funding losses. Next slide, please. Regional COVID-19 mitigation efforts began in earnest on March 21st with Governor Pritzker's stay-at-home order. We just saw on the dashboard how quickly ridership and fare revenue fell in response, and we will see an equally dramatic drop-off in regional spending as most area residents remain close to home and purchase only the essentials. This sudden change in consumer behavior directly affects and impacts RTA sales tax receipts and the associated 30% sales tax public transportation fund match of those receipts. Per the RTA Act, when the board becomes aware of a significant funding change, it is required to notify the service boards via funding amendment, and in turn, the service boards are required to submit revised operating budgets to the RTA. The amendment further recognizes the amount of federal CARES Act funding which is expected to be required to offset RTA funding decreases, and will also explain how such funding will protect our statutory recovery ratio requirement as we move forward through this crisis. Admittedly, we do not know the depth or duration of the sales tax collapse, but we fully expect it will be an unprecedented magnitude. We've consulted with our service board partners and picked up clues from other government entities and various data sources along the way. The funding estimates in the ordinance before you represent our best educated guess based on what we know right now. We won't begin to see actual COVID-impacted sales tax results March until mid-June. Next slide, please. As Leanne mentioned at last month's board meeting, we expect RTA sales tax receipts to decrease by as much as 50% from prior year in the near term. To give you some insight into our thought process, consider for a moment the category which is the largest contributor to our overall sales tax, gasoline and automotive sales. As Jill alluded in her performance report, people are simply traveling much less. IDOT data shows that vehicle volumes on Illinois roads were down more than 50% in April, and as a result, much less gasoline is being purchased. On top of that, the price of gasoline has dropped from $3 per gallon last April to around $2 per gallon, a decrease of more than 30%. The combination of lower consumption, minus 50%, and lower prices, minus 30%, would result in a 65% reduction in the amount of RTA sales tax produced from gasoline sales versus this time last year. Sales in other categories, such as groceries and household goods, think toilet paper, will likely be higher than last year, providing some offset of the harder hit categories. Following the second quarter stay-at-home period, we do expect some easing of the sales tax impact, but as Leanne also mentioned last month, health experts are predicting a resurgence of the COVID-19 virus as we approach next winter, depicted in the pattern of this chart shown as round 2. All told, RTA sales tax receipts for the calendar year are expected to decrease by 28.5% versus 2019. For context, the last major financial crisis resulting in the 2009 RTA sales tax decreasing by only 9.2% versus 2008. So we are indeed facing an unprecedented funding crisis. Real estate transfer tax receipts are assumed to be impacted in line with sales tax, also decreasing by around 30% versus 2019. Next slide, please. Our sales tax assumption on the previous slide results in these amended 2020 RTA funding levels by service board, averaging right around a 30% drop from budget. A total decrease in RTA funding of $543 million. With the exception of ADA paratransit, these funding decreases are expected to be fully offset by like amounts of federal CARES Act funding to be requisitioned by the service board and RTA teams as we move forward. This approach will potentially keep total operating funding at originally budgeted levels. The projected RTA funding decreases displayed on this slide and the expected CARES Act funding backfills are reflected in Schedules 1A and 1B of the proposed ordinances. For ADA paratransit, the funding drop of $52 million shown is estimated to be able to be absorbed due to the reduced demand for ADA service ridership during the pandemic, which in turn reduces operating expense. Thus, CARES Act funding does not come into play for ADA. However, there is considerable uncertainty in PACE ADA's funding requirements for the rest of the year. So the ordinance provides for use of RTA funding, paratransit reserve funds to back up this estimated funding level if necessary, subject to the approval of the RTA board. One final note on the ordinance, it does keep the service board's recovery ratios unchanged from the budget. Those will be addressed with CARES Act funding. Next slide, please. The proposed ordinance also specifically apportions the $1.438 billion of RTA Region CARES Act funding among the service boards and RTA in the same amounts which were communicated at last board's meeting. CTA would receive $117 million, Metra $479.2 million, PACE $112.8 million, and RTA $28.8 million. Of the $1.438 billion of total CARES Act funding, almost $500 million is currently projected to be needed to offset the estimated 2020 RTA funding decreases, excluding ADA paratransit. The service boards will determine the projected amount of CARES Act funding needed to offset their expected 2020 revenue losses when they submit their revised budgets. The ordinance provides that CARES Act funding associated with those fare revenue replacement amounts be budgeted by the service boards as operating revenue and also reported as within their monthly financial results, thus projecting the service board and regional recovery ratios. RTA staff's opinion is that counting CARES Act funding toward the recovery ratios is allowable because the funding is specifically intended to replace lost fare revenue, much like the state reduced fare reimbursement, and thus may be properly included as operating revenue for this purpose. Each of the service boards and the RTA have applied for CARES Act funding, with Metra's application the first to be approved on May 12th. The rest of the applications are in different stages of the approval pipeline, but funding is expected to begin flowing later this month or in June. Next slide, please. The ordinance allows the service boards until August 4th to submit revised operating budgets to the RTA. It is our hope that this 2.5-month period will provide more clarity on ridership recovery profile and thus allow the service boards to better forecast their operating fare revenue for the balance of the year. Revised service board budgets are expected to be considered for adoption by the CTA, Metra, and PACE boards at their July or August board meetings. Any adjustments to service levels or expenses relative to their original 2020 budget are being left to the discretion of those boards. The revised service board budgets will be reviewed by the RTA staff for their usual criteria as balanced and reasonable assumptions, and then consolidated with a revised RTA agency budget to form a revised regional operating budget to be considered for board adoption at the August RTA board meeting. The newly adopted regional budget will provide a comprehensive projection of the amount of CARES Act funding required to be drawn down in support of 2020 operating expenses, and thus will also project how much CARES Act funding may remain for developing the 2021 regional budget. The CARES Act funding drawdown projections contained in the new budget will continue to be refined as actual 2020 monthly service boards and sales tax projections become known. In closing, I recommend that the board adopt the proposed ordinance amending the 2020 RTA operating funding amounts and requiring revised service board operating budgets to be submitted to the RTA. That concludes my presentation, Mr. Chairman. I'll do my best to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Bea. Does anybody have, use your hand raising tool, any questions or comments here?
I don't see any hands raised.
Seeing none. Great, thank you. So can we have a motion?
Tom Cotel motions and Director Sager seconds.
Thank you, directors. With a motion and a second, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 And any opposed, say no. Sounds like it's unanimous, Audrey.
16 ayes.
Thank you. That'll be so recorded. We'll move on to 7C, which is an ordinance approving the 2021 budget call for the annual budget, 2-year financial plan, and 5-year capital plan. Bill, are you going to take us through this one, please?
Yes, I will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. This morning, I am seeking board approval to release the budget and capital program call or simply budget call for short, kicking off our 2021 budget and capital program process. Although COVID-19 has changed our world over the last few months, the basic steps of the budget development process should remain the same. Next slide, please. The budget call is a process document. The proposed 2021 funding amounts, budgets, and capital programs, in other words, all of the numbers, will follow in the coming months. The annual budget planning process begins in May and culminates in December, when the board will consider the service board budgets and capital programs for adoption. In 2020, our regional budget was comprised of an annual operating budget of $3.1 billion and a 5-year capital program of $8.3 billion. Such amounts clearly merit careful and deliberate planning. The budget call lays out the budget planning process in detail. The RTA and the service boards will work through each step, leading to a comprehensive 2021 through 2023 regional budget and financial plan, and a 2021 through 2025 capital program. Next slide, please. The title of this slide is an understatement, to say the least. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has injected extreme uncertainty into every aspect of public transportation planning. As we heard during the dashboard presentation, regional transit ridership plunged by about 80% with the governor's stay-at-home order, and the ridership recovery timeline is unclear. Similarly, RTA sales tax receipts are expected to plummet beginning with the March results, and due to changes in behavior, we may never regain previously planned RTA funding levels. Federal CARES Act funding will be of immense help in the short term, but longer term, recovery ratio relief will be needed from the state legislature due to reduced ridership and fare revenue. As you may have seen in the What's New section of the budget memo, the capital funding allocation process is being modified to incorporate a performance-based approach as directed by the RTA board last December. Finally, the finances of the state of Illinois have been subjected to the same COVID-19 related pressures as those of the RTA and the service boards, with the impact of the state budget on RTA operating and capital funding yet to be determined. We will work through each of these issues with the service board, CFOs, budget teams, and capital groups over the course of the summer and fall. Next slide, please. The key components of the budget call are shown here. The regional economic outlook is the basis for the sales tax forecasts used to set funding levels for the service boards, as well as for the service board's ridership forecast. And the news is obviously not good. The national unemployment rate jumped to 14.7% in April, a level which already exceeds the peak unemployment rate during the 2008-2009 financial crisis. The Congressional Budget Office expects the national unemployment rate to worsen to 16% during the third quarter of 2020, and RTA regional unemployment is expected to reflect this. The service boards examine their individual transportation markets and develop service plans that address the needs and opportunities of those markets, which again will be a significant challenge due to the uncertainties about ridership levels. The budget call provides sample schedules of the information requested by the RTA. The information includes revenues and expenses by category, recovery ratios, staffing levels, service plans, and operating statistics, and financing parameters for any planned debt issuances. New this year, the service boards will include projections of the amounts of CARES Act funding needed to balance their budgets and meet recovery ratio requirements. These schedules are meant to serve as guides. The service boards can submit their information in the formats they use in their own budget processes. Our goal is to obtain consistent information across the service boards so we can present aggregated regional data. For the capital program, the service boards will be required to provide descriptions of all planned projects and how those projects tie to capital program strategic core requirements and strategic regional plans. Next slide, please. The capital program for each service board identifies the projects to be undertaken in the 2021 through 2025 program period within projected funding levels. The RTA also requests that the service boards provide preliminary estimates of additional capital funding from local sources, service board funds, and service board bond issuances planned for the 5-year capital program. In addition, this year, based on RTA board direction last December, a performance-based capital allocations committee was formed of RTA and service board staff. The committee's work is still in progress and will be presented to you in draft form at the July board meeting. It will then be released for a 45-day public review and comment period, followed by a final draft and request for board approval. In anticipation of the approval of the committee's work later this year, it is necessary as part of the budget call to collect the information to implement the new investment framework that is under development. Therefore, beginning this year, we are requesting the following additional information to support that investment framework. Each project will include an estimated or actual project start date and estimated project completion date. The information will be used to monitor project status. The other information that we are requesting for capital projects appears on this slide. The capital program strategic core requirements and goals that are most impacted by the project. This information will be used to communicate the impact of the capital program on achieving the goals and requirements of Invest in Transit. The regional and agency plans that include the projects. This information will be used to communicate the impact of the capital program on achieving the goals of the regional and agency plans. Other elements of the capital budget call process remain the same, including opportunities for public input that are noted on the budget calendar. Next slide, please. I will now close with a summary of the 2021 budget call timeline. Relevant board meeting dates are highlighted in blue. In July, the RTA will provide the service boards with preliminary estimates of the 2021 through 2023 funding levels as a basis for discussions with the service board budget teams. On August 20th, we intend to present the proposed funding amounts and recovery ratios to the RTA board for consideration. The need to gather as much information as possible before setting the funding levels, however, may require this presentation be deferred to the September board meeting, just before the statutory deadline for adoption of the funding amounts. We have pushed back the deadline for submission of the service board proposed budgets and programs to a week later than last year, this year to October 16th, in order to give the service boards as much time as possible. November 15th is the statutory date for the service boards to submit their adopted budgets to the RTA. After consolidating the service board submissions into a proposed regional budget and capital program, The RTA will conduct our required public hearings and county board presentations in late November and early December. On October 19th, the RTA Finance Committee will hold a special meeting to review the service board budgets. Like last year, this meeting is scheduled before Thanksgiving. Finally, on December 17th, we will present to you the Regional 2021 budget and 5-year capital program for adoption. This concludes my presentation seeking board approval to release the 2021 budget and capital program call. I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Anybody have any questions? Remember to use the WebEx hand raising tool.
No hands have been raised.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. So with that, can I have a motion and a second to approve item 7C?
Director Ross moves. And Director Groveman seconds.
Thank you, doctors. All those in favor say aye.
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 And any opposed say nay. Thank you. Thank you, Bill. That will be so reported, Audrey, unanimously on 7C.
16 ayes.
Thank you. Let's move on to 7D, which is an ordinance authorizing an amendment to the 2020 to 2024 capital program. Jill Leary, please.
Thank you again, Chairman Dillard. I'm requesting your approval of an ordinance authorizing an amendment of the 2020 to 2024 capital program, incorporating changes in program revenues and expenses for CTA, Metra, PACE, and PACE ADA. This month, we are asking you to approve a redistribution of Rebuild Illinois capital funding within the 5-year capital program with no change to the overall 5-year funding amount. The purpose of these changes is to align the 5-year capital program with the 2020 spring grant application submitted to IDOT for Rebuild Illinois capital funding. Rebuild Illinois funding of just over $1 billion is moved from the 2021 to 2024 out years to 2020 to advance capital projects that the service boards plan to initiate this year in advance in the implementation of Rebuild Illinois. As I discussed in the quarterly performance report earlier in the agenda, no other changes are proposed in this amendment. The project and budget changes in the capital program are included in the memo of your board materials and in Schedules 2A and 2B attached to the ordinance. RTA staff has reviewed this request and found it to be justified as outlined in the ordinance request memo. I'm happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, we are seeking your approval of this ordinance.
Thank you. Any questions or comments?
I see no hands raised.
Great. So let's do a roll call on this. All those in favor of 7D say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, we need a motion and a second first, please.
That's true. Let's have a motion by the show of hands on the electronic WebEx, please.
Director Holt moves. Director Pang seconds.
Thank you, too. Now we'll roll call. All those in favor of 7D say aye.
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 And opposed, nay.
16 ayes.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, and 7D will be so reported. We'll move on to item 8, which includes contract and expenditure items that require board action today. I'm going to ask the staff to say just a couple of words on each of these items, as these are really consent items, and address any questions. Unless there are any specific objections, we'll vote on them collectively at the end of the remarks for all of the item 8 matters. The first one is 8A, which is an ordinance authorizing the contract for interagency signs, fabrications, maintenance, installation, and storage. Jill?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Leanne covered items 8A and 8B in her executive director report. The first one is for a maintenance contract to maintain the signs that we already have installed within the region. And 8B is for the third bundle, which will complete our signage, interagency signage program.
Great, thank you. If there's anybody have any questions, hit your little WebEx hand raiser. Otherwise, we'll move on to 8B. And 8B is I guess bundle 3 of the ordinance authorizing a contract for interagency signs, fabrications, and installations. Any questions on that?
No hands.
Seeing none. 8C is the ordinance authorizing a contract for subscription for aerial photography. Jill, anything you want to say on that other than these aerial photos are very cool?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, quickly, this contract will allow the RTA, Metra, and PACE, it's a joint contract. We all have separate contracts now, to have unlimited access to online, seamless, high-resolution aerial photography. Having this added access and the data information is extremely useful for both planning and capital projects, and it is updated 3 times a year. Happy to answer any more questions.
Super. Any questions on that?
Director Colson has a question.
Bill?
Yeah, Bill Colson here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We're spending money on existing contracts, and I understand that. But this aerial photograph thing is a new idea, as far as I can tell. And my point, I guess, is while we're in this fiscal crisis that Dee described, I would hope that we can telegraph a certain austerity to the public and to elected officials. And so the question I have on 8C, the pictures are cool, I'm sure, but is this trip really necessary now? Or can we defer it, or can we justify spending $500,000 at this time on cool photographs?
Thank you, Director Colson. We do have access already to aerial photography, so this is it's a new contract for us, but we do have access to that. Also, as I stated, all 3 agencies have separate contracts, so this is an economies of scale issue that we're hoping to move forward. As well as it helps, the resolution is so high that it eliminates a good deal of field work as well. So we think it's important to continue with it.
Okay, well, I'd like a separate roll call on 8C, Mr. Chairman, because I think I'm going to vote no.
Will do. Let's move on to 8D. We'll do 8C separately at the appropriate time. And Jill, thank you for that answer. 8D is an ordinance authorizing the 2021 renewal of excess liability insurance by the loss financing plan and joint self-insurance fund. I know that Nadine has been working and beating her head against the wall on this one, as if at this time, especially with London, this is a very, very difficult process. Nadine, you want to take it from there?
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I think that was a very apt description. Beating your head against the wall is pretty much what this process looks like. And Leanne can attest to that as well. And we do have 2 executives from our brokers at Aon who are available to answer any of the board's questions regarding the process or the market. It's obviously a high value item, but it's absolutely essential at this time that we not have a break in coverage for the entire region. And we're in kind of an unusual situation due to the COVID pandemic. So I am begging the court's indulgence, oh my goodness, the board's indulgence in this kind of unusual process, because we aren't 100% certain at this time of what the cost is going to be. And we're also not 100% certain of the specific markets that will be covering us. We've done everything in our power this year. In fact, we did everything considerably earlier than we normally do for the renewal process. But the markets are not in the habit of giving quotes months in advance. Leanne tried to strongly encourage that we bring this to the board in April, but COVID hit before that time could come, and here we are. They're always afraid of an interim loss, so they never want to give us quotes super early. And then when this happened and everybody had to do new applications because ridership numbers were different, revenue numbers were different, it just created a huge backlog in the market. So I'm hoping that the board will approve us to move forward with contracts up to, I think the number is approximately $7.5 million, and that if the quotes come in at a higher number, that between the committee, which is comprised of all 4 agencies, and the chairman's approval, that you would allow us to move forward with an even higher quote if everyone approves. I'm happy to take any questions.
And obviously we will keep all the board members apprised by memo as to what's going on with this. But it's a very, very, very difficult time with respect to this type of insurance, as the brokers on the phone can attest if people have questions. Anybody have any questions or comments on this?
Seeing no hands.
Seeing no hands, then we'll move on to 8E, which is an ordinance authorizing a contract amendment with Omicron Technologies for the enhancement of RTA's FAIR programs to permit production progress. Michael, you have something to say here?
Yes, good morning, Director and board members. This proposed ordinance authorizes the Executive Director to amend a contract with Omicron Technologies to add funds to the contract value. As a reminder to everyone, Omicron Technologies is our vendor who processes the applications for the reduced fare and ride-free programs, manages our permit printing and mailing process, and operates a call center to help customers related matters in the fare programs. This amendment has several components, some of which are 2 new secure portals into the database. One is to protect PII if customer documentation needs to be added from an offsite location. There's another portal that's going to allow customers to apply for and manage their fare permits online. This reduces paper processes and is more convenient for customers. And it also allows us to develop a remote call center for the call center agents in response to COVID-19 and their safety. And it also changes some pricing to our call center operations. And so with this said, we request approval of this amendment.
Great. Any questions?
Seeing no hands.
Great. Seeing no hands there, we'll move on to the next one, which is also Michael's. That's 8F, the ordinance authorizing a contract amendment with Martin Mallow.
Great, thanks again. This proposed ordinance authorizes the Executive Director to amend a contract with Barton Mallow, and it's adding funds to that contract as well. As a reminder, Barton Mallow is the construction firm that is renovating our 15th floor currently. As with all construction projects, once you start demo, unexpected issues are discovered that cause delays and need to changes to some of the architectural drawings. That leads to some changes in materials that are needed and additional labor expenses. When we sought approval of this contract originally, we did not include a contingency for these types of unforeseen issues. So this amendment will help cover some of these unexpected costs. And again, we would like to request approval of this amendment with Barton Mallow. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one comment. Asbestos was part of this, correct? That's one of the problems.
Yes, that is correct. We had an 8-week delay as a result of finding some asbestos above the ceiling tiles on the floor slab between the 2 floors. That resulted in 8 weeks of delay, which, that costs money. We are seeking some reimbursement from the ownership of 175 to give us funds back for that asbestos abatement, seeing as it was, on their property.
All right. Stay on that, and Nadine, pressure them, and Leanne. Any questions or comments from anybody else on the board?
Director Troiani has a question.
Yes, if it's typical to have unforeseen changes, as you stated, why was a contingency not initially included?
Yes, thank you, Director, for that question. Yes, that was really an oversight on our part. We should have asked for a contingency at the time of requesting our original approval.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Doug, it's Kirk. I think we were crossing our fingers. We wouldn't need a contingency.
That's correct, Chairman.
Any other questions or comments? But
Director Andolfio has a question.
There's a problem. David, do you have a question, sir?
Yeah, I do. Are there any other anticipated issues that may arise from what they just found?
No, thank you, Director. No, we are at the end of the construction project. We've actually, are wrapping up now, and there is no unforeseen issues at this time.
Thank you so kindly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question, though. All right. Any other questions or comments there? So if I could, let's have a motion and a second on item 8A, 8B, 8D as in Dillard, 8E as in Edward, and 8F as in Frank. Let's do those and we'll come back to the aerial photos. Have a motion and a second, please.
Motion by Director Carey, seconded by Director Troiani.
Great. Is there leave for the attendance roll call on those?
Leave.
Please.
Leave.
So seeing no objection there, it'll be recorded 16 to 0 in favor. Thank you. Let's come back to 8C. Just my comments, Director Colson, and as always, your questions are phenomenal and also a very good question. I have three things I want to point out on the aerial photo. Number one is there's an economies of scale because we work very closely with the three other service boards. As Jill said, aerial photos do save a lot of legwork. It does save personnel costs and legwork. And then the last one is because we're in an unprecedented time for hopefully, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed, progress on the capital or infrastructure side, these aerial photos become more important as we have and are about to undertake the state's largest capital program in its history. So, Bill, I have the same questions and concerns you do, but because of the economies of scale, staff legwork, but also importantly, we're in the middle of an unprecedented capital program. I'm going to be in favor of 8C. So with that, I don't know if there's any more comments.
Director Sager has a question.
Yes, Doctor.
Yes, this is Brian Sager. I just wanted to verify, I believe that Jill said earlier that the budgetary items existed within each of the service board's budgets for this. And so we are collapsing these into one in the RTA. Is that correct, or was I misunderstanding that?
Director, this is Jill. Yes, that is correct. All three had separate contracts and access to the aerials.
All right, so we are collapsing all of those into one line item, basically in the RTA budget, correct?
Correct.
And so could you tell me what the comparative values are then? What was the total value in those three separate service board budgets now compared to the budget item in RTA?
I apologize. I don't have that information right at my fingertips. I'm happy to get that after the meeting.
Well, I think that's frankly important. I would like to know that if we're trying to collapse and we're trying to see some economy of scale, I think it's worthy of having that information before us. Thank you.
Jill or Leanne, is it a big problem if we don't do this today and we put it off till June?
Yeah, we can track it down. I guess the point would be that it would not be less than what we have now. I mean, the plan is to have one contract that is supporting, multiple agencies with one line item, and individually then doing it there will be a greater expense.
So what's the board's wishes? You want to wait till June or you want to vote on it today?
This is Ryan Higgins. I am sympathetic to both sides of the question, but would like to see the math showing that the aggregated line item cost of RTA is less than the other agencies individually.
Okay. Well, Jill and Leanne, let's just wait till the June meeting and put this back on the agenda for June, if that's okay.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Sure, we can do that. Jill, I just wanted to confirm that there was no concerns on the procurement side, if there's any nuance that I'm not aware of.
No, that sounds good. We will get all that information to the board and hopefully put it to consideration for the June board meeting.
Director Andalcio has a question.
I thought there was going to be probably an additional expense if this procurement is postponed. Am I correct in that?
Director, can you repeat your question? There was a lot of static.
Oh, I said that if I heard correctly, I thought it was stated that there may be an additional cost to this if this item is postponed and taken individually.
Director, this is Jill. I think the additional cost would be if we split the contract back up into the separate parts, but that's the information that's being called for by the board. So we'll get that information and present it again at the June board meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Director Sagar has another question.
Yes, this is Brian Sager again. The question is, Chairman, do you wish to have a motion to postpone to time specific? Is that something you would desire, or are we going to do that by action of the chair?
We'll just move 8C off the next month, if that's okay. Can everybody hear me?
Thank you.
All right. Audrey, can we move on to item 9 now, new business?
Yes, we will defer 8C to the June meeting.
Okay, let's move on to item 9, which is new business. Any new business to come before the board today? If not, as a reminder, the next scheduled meeting for the RTA board is Thursday, June 18th at 9 a.m. We'll advise as to whether it's real or whether it's virtual as the COVID-19 crisis continues to move forward. But until then, I hope everybody stays safe and healthy. And if there is nothing else to come before the board of directors, can we have a show of hands for a motion in a second?
Director Andalcio and Director Higgins.
Great, thank you. We have a motion and a second to adjourn. Thanks, everybody. A special thanks to the IT staff. This is very good. The technology was awesome, and I thank everybody. And we will stay in touch. Stay safe, and we are adjourned. Thank you so much.
Be safe. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you.
Be well.
Thank you.